Sophie Art Podcast, episode 234, take 1. lilDENNiS. Hello, this is Sophie Lawson from sophielawson.com, and this is episode 234 of the Sophie Art Podcast, which is a little podcast to do about the art and tings with me co-host lilDENNiS. And lilDENNiS is going to get us right into this one. Boing! In we go. And today we are looking at, well, this is a dump and doodle. A dump and doodle. So kitty kisses and lilDENNiS and Kitty have had their kisses. They're in their little house, spinning around. I think they're having fun. But what we do on this one is, I haven't done a dump and doodle for ages. The dump and doodle is basically, it's a brain dump and some doodling. So if you're watching this one on YouTube, at youtube.com/Sophie Lawson, you're able to see this as a video. You see me doodles and that. But in my sketchbook, I've actually created some little logos for some of my characters, which I thought was quite interesting. Oh, and I've also been working on a little comic for my character Peter the Penguin. But what I'm going to do on this one is, what the topic is, it's all about healing childhood wounds. So I think this is going to be quite an interesting one actually. Now it's a bit of a strange one, because I've actually got the audio. I've already recorded the audio on my phone. Because the other day when I was walking home from work, I had the idea for this podcast, so I quickly started taking notes, and before I knew it, it sort of turned into like, I was talking a lot more than I thought I would, and instead of just taking the notes and talking about it again, I thought I'd just play the audio and talk about it sort of thing, while I'm doing some doodling. But some of the stuff I'm also going to try and doodle my mum and dad as lines and shapes. But I've put don't think, because childhood wounds, I've noticed, are to do with your mum and dad. Well, not always, but a lot of them are, especially for me. So, my mum and dad are very much sort of linked to my unresolved issues, I suppose. I'm also going to talk a little bit about a dream where I had this child, and I had a bit of a realisation about that one. The first thing I've got to do is decide what I'm going to be using, and I think I'm going to use a pencil that my niece bought me for Christmas a few years ago, and it says draw your heart out, and I believe I've got a 2B lead in this one, because I likes me 2B leads. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to just start doodling and play the clip. So I've actually got 3 clips. One's 6 minutes, one's a minute, and the other one's 23 seconds. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it alright. And the other thing is, I wasn't planning on putting this audio into the podcast. So it might be a bit sort of messy, I suppose. But let's see what we got. Hopefully you can hear this. Talk about how experiences from the past, or just experiences, can create multiple wounds. So you can go into an experience and heal it, but you've actually only healed one part of it. That's the first thing. So the first thing is that experiences have multiple wounds that need healing. Talk about how I thought I'd healed that, but I hadn't really. Yeah, that's a bit like the mind. This is something Divine Truth talks about on, AJ talks about on the Divine Truth, like the podcast or what thing. He says about how you can basically, he called it, there's one called the Divine Love Path, one's called the Natural Love Path. what it is you can actually think you've sort of healed things, and you sort of have, but you haven't really. What you've done is your mind has tricked you into thinking you've healed it, but really you haven't. And he says, like, a lot of people die, and the spirits, they think they've healed themselves, but they've actually still got unresolved issues. So I think this is the thing here. I've never realised that an experience from the past can actually have multiple wounds attached to it. So what I'm saying is, I think that's what happened with me. I thought I had healed something, and I hadn't, but my mind had tricked me into thinking I had. So if I hadn't have had this realisation this week, I may never have gone back to that experience because I thought I'd healed it. And I think what happens is the mind is so sneaky and clever, but it's also got like a sort of a protective thing. It's trying to. There's something. I feel like we're sort of. I feel like we've got entities inside of us. That's the only way I can describe it. Like 3 entities. There's me. There's a negative one and a positive one. And it seems like the negative one is actually attached to the wounds, and it doesn't want you to heal them. So what happens is, it's so clever, because the thing is, because it's inside of you, it knows you. I think it sometimes knows you better than you know yourself. So it knows exactly what to do and say in order to trick you into thinking you've done something when you haven't. So that's what I'm thinking there. So what I'm thinking now is you've actually got to be even more sort of vigilant with everything. You can't just assume you've healed something. If you think you have, you might not have. But I think you actually know when you have because you really feel it. I'll talk about that later with something. I think I'll talk about that. How if situations keep happening in your life. Oh yeah. If they just keep happening in your life, what it means is it's the universal God trying to tell you to look at this. Ask yourself, what am I feeling? Basically, don't ask why it's happening, because it's irrelevant. Ask, what are you feeling? I like that, because what happened for me, an example is I had this reoccurring thingy of like noisy neighbours, and I found myself sort of sometimes saying, oh, why is this happening? Not in a negative, like, oh, why? It was more like why is this happening? Trying to understand why it was happening. But you don't have to ask why it's happening. It doesn't matter that that's happening. What matters is what you're feeling. Like, what is that experience making you feel? And I'd never really thought about that before. But only, I'd say maybe, well, this year I've started feeling what I'm feeling instead of just trying to work it out. Even if it's like anger. If you feel anger, basically there was a time when I thought I'm not allowed to feel anger, because I thought anger was negative. But I feel like now you can feel anger. And this again is the mind. The mind is tricking you into thinking not to go into the anger because it's making you think it's negative. It probably is negative, but sometimes you've got to go into it to heal it. So that was a big one for me this week. Sort of, I thought that was quite cool. Because what's happened was, something happened this week. Do I talk about this later? I don't think I do. Basically, something happened, and what it done was, it triggered. I had an overreactive emotion to it, like a negative emotion, which was way out of proportion with the experience. I think I'll talk about that in a minute. So, and what I did was, when I really thought about this, and it actually come to me in a dream as well, like when I was writing in my automatic writing, having just woken up, I'd had a series of dreams based around my childhood, and when I did my automatic writing, I had like a realisation about how the experience was linked to a childhood thing. So what I'm thinking is, the reason that I was having such a emotional response to the experience was because it was actually bringing up an unhealed emotion from my childhood. And the thing that's weird about this is, even that emotion was sort of in my childhood, it was repeating in my childhood. So the wound that I've got in my childhood happened multiple times with different people as well, which is linked to my mum and dad. So that's quite funny how, like, the wound itself can be repeated in the past, and then in the future you have an experience, and it's the same experience but happening in different ways. This is why it's more important, I think, to feel the emotion. Did you hear me belly rumble? What I've noticed is, if you're talking about something, like, I would say quite important, I've noticed that I tend to get hiccups, belly rumbles and things like that. Almost as if somehow the emotion is sort of like coming out of your body or something. It's a bit weird. The thing is, this week has been probably it's been a very, I would say it's been a negative a week in a way, because it's been a week of sort of going right inside myself, really. I would say it's negative, but I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot from this week. I've had so many realisations. It's been amazing, really. So it's another example of how nothing's really positive or negative. Everything's just an experience. Oh, that's cool. That goes into this week's inspirational quote. This week's inspirational quote says, "The opposite of love is fear, but what is all-encompassing can have no opposite." That's sort of like the same thing. In a weird way, I think that's the same sort of thing. Like, there is no positive and negative, really. It's just an experience. But, like, you decide if it's positive or negative. And what I'm noticing is, things that have happened in your past, they will make you think that things in the future are negative when they're not. It's that thing, I call it the probability-based beings. Like, somebody who's just living off of their childhood wounds is sort of, the probabilities is sort of like controlling their life. And also, I'm trying to look and see if you're an emotion that is way out of proportion with the experience you've just had. Because that, to me, is saying that what's happening is the experience is triggering an unhealed wound that you don't know you've got because you've buried it deep inside of yourself, but the emotion of it, it's still there. So in other words, like how if you got like a path of cement and you put a groove through it, if you put water on that, the water is just naturally going to go through the groove. So you can cover that path up with something like a piece of paper, but the water will actually still find a way into the groove. Get into the groove. So what I'm saying is, this is why these things are positive, actually. This is why, as soon as you've healed it, it won't happen again. And if it did happen, because I think what also happens is it doesn't happen again. I think it doesn't happen again, but every so often it will happen again, because the universe needs to test you, just to see if you've actually properly healed from it. This is what happens in dreams as well. Sometimes a monster will show up, and as soon as you sort of say to the monster, I'm not scared, the dream ends. Almost as if it's just the dream trying to see if you've actually... It's one thing to say you're fearless, it's another thing to actually be fearless. So that's what I'm saying. What else is it? I'm going to take those 2 plastic pots. What happened was, on the way to work, I recorded this walking home from work about 9 o'clock in the morning. On the way to work at about, about 10 to 5 in the morning, I was walking to work, I saw these 2 big plastic containers. Somebody had thrown them out, and I said to myself, if they're still there when I'm walking home, I'm going to pick them up. So what happened here was, I saw those plastic containers were still there, but there was actually people walking around, and I was waiting until everyone went away so that I could get these containers, take them home. What was the other thing I was going to say? Get into the groove, you've got to move, So the dream, this week's podcast is going to be all about, childhood rooms that need healing. Childhood wounds that need healing. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Childhood wounds that need healing. I'm going to take those because they'll be handy. This week's podcast is going to be about childhood wounds that need healing. 5p in there? Yeah. There's a 5p in the plastic container. Experiences that keep happening in your life are trying to show you. They're actually positive, they're trying to show you that something needs healing. And I also want to talk about Mum and Dad's sort of attributes, which are positive, but when they've gone too far in one direction, they actually become negative. Like, for instance, Dad's a workaholic, or at least he was. And that was because he was I don't know what the actual balanced version of that is, but... Yeah, what is the balanced version of somebody who is a workaholic? I think the balanced version... Because being a workaholic, I would say, is negative, but the attribute of it is actually positive. Because I feel like the attribute of a workaholic is somebody who's very hard working, very sort of determined, committed, reliable, but I would say there's some sort of unhealed wound that creates the workaholic. It's probably somebody who doesn't feel good enough or something. Maybe. Basically, if you're out of balance of whatever that is, you become a workaholic. But if you can get that in balance, it's good, because it means you work your arse off. Work, rest and play. That's what they say, isn't it? Whereas that is very much work. I think I'm work and rest. I think I'm play as well. I think I'm a lot more balanced than I think I am. I definitely, maybe I've lost a little bit of the working bit, but then there's different types of working. There's physical working, there's mental working, and I'm doing a lot of the mental work at the minute. So, that's what I'm saying. Also, Mum's positive towards it. She's very compassionate, very forgiving and stuff, but again, if you become too forgiving, people walk all over you. So you don't stand up for yourself. And I can see how I've got inside of me Mum and Dad's attributes, which is insane. Yeah. When I really look at my mum and dad, I can see how I've got inside of me their attributes. It's almost like I feel like what it is all of your mum's wounds and all of your dad's wounds go into you. So you end up with like all of these wounds from your mum and dad, but they're actually positives in a weird way. Because like one of my mum's wounds is something to do with, I would say, not standing up for herself. So I've got that as well, but I can also see how that's a positive because it makes you like compassionate sort of thing. It's very interesting. What did I do here? I think I was whispering on this one. Also talk about how I've noticed when you're working on a deep emotion, deep healing thing, for me, I need to be absolutely on my own. Because when I'm opening unhealed wounds, I become insanely sensitive to energies around me. Especially if the person around me is linked to the healing. If the person around me is linked to the wound, I find that I will actually act out the suppressed emotion. So if I'm suppressing hatred towards somebody, if I'm working on that unhealed wound and that person's around me, I will feel hatred and I will, if I'm not careful, start acting out hatred. So it becomes very a delicate operation. It's a delicate operation. It is though. So this is where it ends up with me is it's almost like you have to start accepting that you've got inside of you really, really negative and dark emotions. This is quite interesting. Last night at art class, we had to basically bring in our own photo reference and do a drawing. I'll talk about it on the next art class podcast, which I think will be next week. But the thing I drew, it ended up looking a bit like, if you've ever seen Stranger Things, one of the boys on that, he was like sketching the monster sort of thing. It looks a bit like that. It looks very sort of what's the word? Sinister. So I feel like what happens with art is, without even realising it, art sort of shows you emotions. So, but this is the thing, like you're trying to process these negative emotions that are coming up without actually becoming negative, and it is quite hard. I find it hard because I find when I'm processing these emotions from my childhood, like unhealed wounds or whatnot, I just find that I find it a lot harder to what happens is you lose control of your emotions, I suppose. Something like that. but I feel like you've just got to let it happen. But I do find it a bit upsetting for people who are around you, because you can actually take it out on other people when it's not their fault, sort of thing. But then I also wonder whether it is their fault in a way, because if I'm acting in a certain way which is negative to that person, well, that person is then having to face emotions of their own because of me. And it might be that I'm acting that way because of them in the past. Can you see how cool that is in a way? It's almost like 40 years ago, 30 years ago, they did something which wasn't their fault really, because it was something that somebody did something to them which made them do that to me. And then for 30 years nothing happened. But then in the future, when I start processing that emotion, it makes me act in a certain way towards that person. So what's happening now is they've actually got to face what they did in the past. See how you're sort of like entangled with them? Because you're facing the issue, it forces them to face the issue as well. This is why I think it's very important. I feel like it's really important to keep people in your life, especially the ones who are the most sort of basically all of our childhood wounds, they're normally linked to people. So I think it's quite important to keep the people in your life who are linked to these wounds. That's what I'm thinking. I've got one more clip here, which was this morning. Oh yeah, this was interesting. Dealing with childhood wound. Yeah, what's happened is, so I've been dealing with these wounds for the last few days, and it's really come to the surface. Basically what's happened is, something happened this week where somebody, I suppose you could say, I felt like they let me down. That's what it felt like. And then when I've looked into it, I've found that as a child, there were different situations which triggered the same emotion of feeling abandoned. And that, what happens now is, if somebody lets me down, it makes me feel abandoned, like from my childhood. And I never realised that until I really sat with what I was feeling when I got let down. So again, when I look at this now, I look at that person letting me down as a positive, because it was like that person, without, or at least that experience, was shining a light on something in the past that was like a blockage, an unhealed wound. So now I'm at a point now where I'm trying to sort of what's happened is, I'm now, all these emotions have come to the surface, really sort of well, the other night I was crying, and this is when I know God is talking. Tears, for some reason, tears seem to be the way that the universe or God or the truth, truth seems to reveal itself in the physical via tears. Like either extreme joy or extreme sadness, they create tears. And if you've ever had those like uncontrollable tears where you're crying, but it's a different type of crying, and that is actually to do with these emotions getting released. But what I found is, after this happens, I become incredibly exhausted. like really, like mentally just exhausted, and I actually don't like being around people. That's what I've noticed for some reason, and I think it goes back to that thing about being super sensitive. Like when I'm releasing these emotions, I end up so sensitive to like energies and stuff. Like, yeah, I just need to be on my own, really, which is a bit hard when you have to go to work and stuff like that. So it's quite sort of, sometimes I think like these monks and that are very lucky in that they can process these deep emotional wounds, and then they can sit with it for weeks and months in complete silence, like letting the emotion sort of, because I think what happens is these emotions come up, they get transmuted into positive stuff. Now this goes into what happened this morning. I was waiting outside a shop, so I got my sketchbook out, started doing some little sketches. I didn't even think about it, I started writing about an idea. And what's happened is, I've got this idea, it's going to revolve around a new podcast and stuff like that. I don't really want to talk about it yet because I just want to do it. Instead of talking about stuff, I just want to do it. But what happened was, this idea come up, and all of a sudden, all these other ideas that I've had over the last couple of years, it's as if all of these ideas go into this one new idea. So it's almost like I've got this super idea, and all these other little ideas which I thought were going to be cool on their own, they now go into this bigger thing. Now what's even more amazing is, I was listening to what happened was, just after that I put a podcast on, which is called, it's a new podcast that I've only just started listening to. My iPhone, what's happened is my iPhone is so full of, it's running out of memory. But this podcast is called Creative Pep Talk, and the episode was called A Powerful Technique for Doing Less but Producing More. Episode 378. It says, no time, and then it says a powerful technique thingamajigs. But what happened was, he was talking about how the world we live in, they make it look, basically we're in a world where everything has to be like instant. Like, so you get an idea, pop it straight out on social media. Like, it's basically like everything's fast paced, he's saying. Well, what he said is the secret is to actually, well, it goes back to that thing, balancing work and play, work and rest. So in other words, an idea pops into your head. Instead of just throwing it out there straight away, what he's saying is keep it in your head. And what will happen is it will actually, like sort of, like when you've got like loads of food in a cauldron, the longer you like leave it there, it's sort of all the flavours, you get more flavours. So he's saying, leave these ideas in your head and let them sort of mature. Now I feel like that's what's happened. All these ideas that I've had in my head, they've been in my head, I released them, but I've just left them there. And now what's happened is this other idea comes along, and it's like sort of brought all these other ones together. And what happened, as I was walking home, I thought to myself, is it possible that by sort of facing this or releasing this childhood emotion, these wounds, I wouldn't say I've overcome it yet, but what's happened is I can see the connection between events in my past and the way I feel about the way certain things trigger me in the present, which I've never experienced. I've never been able to work that out before. I didn't see the connection. So what I'm wondering is it possible that by sort of like releasing that blockage, that energy can actually now go into this other thing, which is a creative thing. And I've said all along, like the last few years I have not been producing much art, but it's because I've been doing a lot of like inner work. And I do believe what will happen in the end is, basically, if you can find balance in your mind, I feel like you're going to be a master, like creating. Because I feel like, for me at least, I find it quite hard to be creative when my mind is out of balance. But then I also know sometimes you can use that in your art. But all I can say is I've got a feeling deep in my bones that the best thing for me to do is work on my mind. And I can tell it's going to be worth it in the end. But I was also thinking that this morning, like some of these, like the way I was feeling earlier this week, it was so sort of emotional. You sort of think to yourself, this better be worth it. Like, whatever this life is, and all these emotions we're facing and stuff, it better be worth it in the end. Like, you've just got to basically trust. You've got to trust that it's going to be worth it in the end. Because there's no guarantee that it is, really. That's it. Where's me notes? I seem to have lost me note. I had a little, here it is. Oh yeah, I haven't done that yet. So I've played the audio clips. I've done some doodling. What have I done? I've created something here that looks a little bit like fingers. Look like little fingers. There's lots of pyramids everywhere. There's lots of sets of 3 as well. And there's lots of... I'm noticing lots of... like pairs, basically. Like, for me, that's sort of representing entanglement. Because I do feel like emotions... like unresolved... I feel like entanglement is a big part of emotions. I've seen these pyramids as well. Lots of circles and pyramids. Oh, I've got to talk about that dream. It's only just a little thing. Basically what happened was I had this dream, and I've talked about this before. I've got these 2 reoccurring characters in my dream, which is a little girl and a little boy. So this week I have been mostly going into my childhood in my dreams. So what I did was, before I went to bed, I said, I want to face my childhood. Basically, I don't know what I'm supposed to be facing, or I didn't know what I was supposed to be facing, but I could tell it was to do with my childhood. And that's when all this stuff come up about feeling abandoned and stuff. And it's very interesting that there was this little boy showed up again. And what I know, there was a little girl and a little boy. The little girl was in front of me so I could see her. The little boy was always behind me so I couldn't see him. And as I was walking home from work the other day, I thought to myself, if something is behind you in the dream, Robert Wagner says that's basically like your shadow self. So I'm thinking this little boy is linked to my shadow, something to do with my shadow. And I do think it goes back to when I was strangled. 1993 I was strangled, and this goes into what I was talking about earlier. I had a lucid dream a few years ago, and I said I want to relive being strangled, and I felt like I had released. For me, that's still one of my most powerful lucid dreams, because I definitely released something that day to do with like being that day when I got strangled, and I thought I had healed it. But what I've worked out this week is basically that experience of being strangled it created multiple emotional wounds. So I think what happened that day when I had the lucid dream, I think I healed some part of it, but there's these other 2 parts I haven't healed. or at least one part, and it's to do with, so it's something to do with guilt and abandonment, because there was an abandonment there as well during that experience. And what I'm thinking is, this little boy who keeps popping into my dreams, I think he's linked to this abandonment, and something in my shadow is to do with this feeling of abandonment or something. Like I say, at the minute I'm just trying, all these emotions are coming up like sort of pieces of a puzzle, but for the first time I can actually see what the picture looks like. So this is why it's quite exciting. But the other thing is, you've got all these pieces coming up, so you feel a bit like, well, where do I start? But the cool thing is, I can see how everything's sort of falling into place, which is quite cool. And what this little boy was doing as well was, in the dream, I was sat in a chair. I was sat in the front seat of a car with, I think my dad was on my right, and I had my seatbelt on. I've got that thing again where I've got like the bubbles coming up in my throat. Yeah, like it's like hiccups inside of yourself. Now what I'm thinking is, this is actually, I'm convinced now that I'm convinced that emotions are like bubbles in our body, and they're getting like they're coming up through our body. So there's actually a physicalness to these emotions, which is quite interesting. What happened was, I was sat in this chair in the car, the little boy was sat on the seat behind me, but he was actually pushing his feet into the back of the chair, and I could feel his legs going right into my back. And I was actually saying to Dad, I kept saying, Dad, can you tell him to stop that? And then what happened was, I woke up, I had this pain in my back. Now, there's two ways to look at that. Either I had a pain in my back and that was manifesting into the dream, or the boy was creating the pain in the dream and it was manifesting into my physical body. Something like that. Just like that. But what happened here was, again, I've made this connection. So I haven't had it a lot. It's been quite a while since I had this, but I used to have a lot. I'd have these dreams with like things digging into my back, like entities basically. And at that same time, I was watching a video, but I can't remember. I don't know who it was. I want to say it was Bob Monroe with his out of body stuff, when he was talking about different entities. Somebody did a video talking about, and they drew this diagram of like a person. They drew a diagram of a person, and attached to them at the back was like an entity that was attached to their back. And it was one of these things I thought, this is insane, because they were actually explaining what I had been experiencing in the dream. So what I'm saying is, what if this little boy is like, that little boy could be linked in with this entity? But what I want to know is, why is it linked to your back? And I'd imagine it's something to do with, I don't know what the chakra is at that point. Like, I don't know enough about the chakras, but I know there is a chakra at like the base of your spine. So I would imagine whatever this shadow is, it's to do with that, probably to do with that chakra or something. So I don't know if that's to do with what's it called? Abandonment or something. So I need to look into that chakra. But what I love about this is how the waking state and the dream state, like, wow, it's brilliant. It is. You're working on yourself in the waking state, and the dream will do something. You process that, and then you. It's almost like the dream and the waking state are sort of helping each other. but it very much does talk in like riddles. So that's what's been happening there. So all I'm going to do now, I'm going to draw. I haven't thought about this. I did my absolute best to not think about this. I'm going to try and do a little doodle, like a squiggle or shapes or something of my mum and dad, because I just want to sort of see what comes up, what shapes I think me mum and dad are. And I purposely didn't think about this so what I'm going to do, me mum. If I was drawing me mum, what would I draw? If I was drawing my dad as a shape, what would I draw? That was interesting. Me mum is like a flowing heart thing, but it's going down. So I started one way and it actually went down. Whereas my dad went up and then went sideways. And so my dad is more of a straight. You could look at my dad as looks like a little cliff. I can imagine somebody jumping off of me dad, like a little cliff edge, whereas me mum looks more like a piece of rope, and I'd feel like you'd actually be climbing up that. How cool is this? So I drew me mum going downwards, but for me it represents like climbing up, almost like an ascension, and it actually loops back in on itself as well, which I like. Whereas I drew me dad going up, but for me it represents going downwards, like into the abyss. I quite like that. My mum's also there's almost like a heart shape in my mum's shape, whereas my dad's got no sort of. My dad had no, like, it felt very disconnected, me dad, whereas my mum, it almost feels like it could connect with itself. That was interesting. If I had to draw them as shapes, what would I draw me? If I drew me mum, this is what I'm thinking. This is weird because I wouldn't have thought I'd draw me mum like this. If I had to draw my dad, I'd draw my dad like that. That's very interesting. I never thought I would have used triangles for my mum, but I use triangles, and like when I've been looking at character designing and stuff, triangles are normally sort of you would use them for like negative emotions or something, because they got like sharp edges. Whereas my dad, I've actually almost like created a doorway of a tunnel, which is curving. So I would have thought I would have done it the other way around. It's very interesting. So me dad looks like just imagine like a tunnel, like the darkness of a tunnel, which you could say that links in with like the abyss thing. But I kind of like that because you're going into a tunnel scared. So I feel like there's fear associated with my dad. That's what I'm thinking. My mum's got very long legs, and I did draw triangles, but what actually happened was the triangles turned into. Basically, what happened was there were triangles that started turning into opposite triangles. So I could almost imagine like a mirror version of my mum. Sort of, I don't know how you draw that in reverse. I've done that wrong, I think. Yeah, but I could imagine a mirrored version of my mum there. But even though I've drawn my mum as triangles, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 triangles. That's interesting. 6 body parts. You got your arms, your legs, your body and your head. 6. I've always found the number 6 to represent out of balance. So maybe that's like my mum's sort of out of balance or something. My dad is very confusing, that shape, because I find it quite a positive shape, but very much like a tunnel. you go into a tunnel, there might be a monster in there. So it's almost like inviting you in, but it could actually, the minute you've walked in that tunnel, it caves in and you're trapped. I feel like that tunnel shape is very, very interesting. I like that. But what it also makes me think is about exploring. Like a tunnel, I would like to go into it exploring. So as long as you go into it with the right equipment, you sort of should be alright. So for me, it's saying to me that I've still got to explore. I've still got exploring to do with my dad. Whereas with my mum, she's got very long legs, which makes me feel like she's sort of going upwards. And she does look a little bit like a star here, in this little doodle. And I like stars. Yeah, there's very much a sort of going upwards with my mum's shape there. So even though it's using like angular shapes, which you would think are negative, there's a positive vibe to the shape, like the overall shape. That's brilliant. I've never done anything like that before, and if I had thought about it, I would never have created these shapes and lines. Oh, that's brilliant. I'm going to do that. Well, the thing is, you can only do this once, really. Or maybe you could do it again. I'd like to do this more with other people. But for me, really, the only people I'm interested in understanding is me mum and dad. Because I feel like they're key to everything. I do. I think our mum and dads are key to everything. So that's it for this one. lilDENNiS, he's gonna get us out of here. Hey, lilDENNiS, little diddy diddy. Boing. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. All that's left is this week's little inspirational quote, and it comes from a book I found in the second-hand shop about a month ago called A Course in Miracles. Now this book is massive. It's basically 3 books in one, I think it is. It's the text, the workbook, and a manual or something. Apparently it's 3 books in one, and there is what is it? There's like about 306 chapters. I've never seen a book with that many chapters. A Course in Miracles. It says, since it was first published privately in 1976, look, it says, see, this is why you need to have an open mind with stuff. Although Christian in language, the course is a perennial philosophy presented in a way which is meaningful for us today. It is a self-study course designed to shift our perceptions, heal our minds, and change our behaviour. So even though it's like using Christian language, because I did see the word God in some of the chapters, even though it's using the word God, I feel like basically, for me, I think the word God, it doesn't have to be God. Like, you can just replace it with universe or something. I feel like the word is not important. It's what it actually feels. Words mess up a lot of things, I think. But this week's inspirational quote, I love this. The opposite of love is fear, but what is all-encompassing can have no opposite. I love that. Now it says something here which I can't quite get my head around. It says, this course can therefore be summed up very simply in this way. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. I can't quite understand that. Nothing real can be threatened. I sort of get it. Yeah, what's really real is not what we think is real. In other words, reality is not real. It's truth that's real, and truth cannot be threatened. Because truth is basically whatever God is, it's truth. And like the oneness, so truth is the oneness, which can't be threatened. So the reason I was getting confused, I was thinking real as in reality. And it says nothing unreal exists. So what is unreal is reality, which is all mind. It's all mind-generated lies from unhealed wounds. And they don't really exist. They only exist because you think. They only exist because you haven't healed the wounds. I think I sort of understand. I like this bit though. The opposite of love is fear, but what is all-encompassing can have no opposite. A Course in Miracles. Arse!